It's nice to have you back. This next section of the presentation is going to focus a little bit more directly on the parish itself. And because this could be a whole course in and of itself, I'm going to have to focus in on foundations, foundational attitudes and foundational methodologies for parishes and new evangelization. And try to answer the question, how might parishes be made ready and capable for a new evangelization? Surprisingly, maybe the church is saying that the old methodologies that we've been using for evangelization will no longer work for the new evangelization. It's a stunning admission, given the changes and the rapid changes in the context of the West. We might remind ourselves that when the United States Church wanted to conduct its own first great awakening in the 19th century, it had to create its own new methodologies. And the first great methodology that it created was the parochial school system, a massive effort in stone. And it also created a second methodology called the Baltimore Catechism, that document with clear and distinct ideas, which were in vogue philosophically at the time. So I'm going to see whether it actually was effective. Question number 6. Why did God make you? Case closed. It actually worked. So what is the new evangelization? What's meant by the new evangelization? Is it really any different from the old evangelization? Perhaps no one has given a better description, not a definition, but a better description of what the church means by new evangelization than Archbishop Rino Fisichella, who was a professor at the Gregorian when I studied there, who is now leading the effort across the world. And he says that the new evangelization is a form by which the gospel is proclaimed with new enthusiasm, a new language, which is comprehensible in a different cultural situation, and with new methodologies that are capable of transmitting its deepest sense, that sense which remains immutable. So it's about a gospel being proclaimed. This is not a sociological initiative. This is about the gospel being proclaimed. But it's about evangelization that has 4 elements to it. It has to be done with a new enthusiasm. The old enthusiasms don't work. So we need to know, we have to start thinking about what's a new enthusiasm look like? How do you get to a new enthusiasm? It also has to use a new language. So that immediately sets up in our mind, what are the old languages that we have been using? The church is not saying that old enthusiasm and the old language is bad. It's saying that it was effective then. But it's saying that old enthusiasms and old language cannot produce the new evangelization that is needed. It has to recognize a different cultural context. And it has to use new methodologies. The Baltimore Catechism, as successful as it was, look at you, you did that perfectly, may not be the methodology that's needed for the new evangelization. Okay? So, but the church is also saying another thing, which has probably not gotten as much play as needed. That the new evangelization is tied to another concept that the church has used recently, which is integral evangelization, a holistic evangelization. That when we think about evangelization, most of us go first and foremost to proclamation and catechesis. That's our paradigm in our head, that evangelization is only proclaiming and it's only teaching, catechesis. But the church, in its documents on mission and dialogue, has talked about an integral evangelization that has 5 elements. And those 5 elements are presence and witness, proclamation, catechesis, liturgy, prayer, and contemplation, human liberation and social development, and 5thly, ecumenical dialogue. So if you want to be doing evangelization and a new evangelization in your parish, you have to be doing all 5. But you have to be doing it in a new way. You have to be doing it with a new enthusiasm, with new language, with new cultural contexts, and with new methodologies. Let's stop and think about that for a moment. Presence and witness. How does your parish have a presence and witness in your neighborhood? Are people enthused in your parish about their presence as Catholics? How do they witness? What languages do you use to describe your presence and witness? Well, the building itself is a language. It says, we're here on this corner. But that's an old language. Is that a sufficient language for the future? What methodologies do you use for your presence and witness? The bulletin, the signage outside that you may or may not be able to read as you're driving by. So what the church is saying is take a look at everything that you do. Take a look at every dimension of evangelization and start asking yourself the question, are we using old language, and what is it? Or are we using new language? Are we developing an old enthusiasm, resurrecting the old enthusiasm, or are we developing a new enthusiasm? Are we sensitive to the new cultural context? And are we developing new methodologies? Now we have to ask ourselves, why do we need new language, new methodology, new enthusiasm? Some of the old language, just to kind of whet the appetite here. Some of the old language is, David Tracy says, we live in a nameless time. We don't know what language to use. Sometimes we're using pre-modern language, sometimes we're using modern language, sometimes we're using postmodern language. What language do we use? Brian Massengale, who's an ethicist, moral theologian in Milwaukee, says, we seem to be using 2 languages of nostalgia on one part and despair on another. 60s theological debate between von Balthasar and Ratzinger was concilium language on one side and communal language. When I was at the seminary, we used to have what I used to call the red hymnal, blue hymnal fight. We had seminarians who would only sing from the red hymnal, which had the deposit of faith songs. And they'd never open up the red hymnal. It was a red state, red hymnal, blue hymnal problem. Well, all that kind of language we have to let go of. We have to find and develop a new language to speak about the transmission of faith in an enthusiastic way. But as I was thinking about this workshop, I kept coming back to the realization that it pivots on one grand and untested assumption that the revival of American Catholicism and the reinvigoration of faith for a new generation of Americans will happen largely and mainly in parishes. And I want to ask the question here today, is that true? Can that really happen? Is that really possible. So let's take a look for a moment at some of those realities. First of all, parishes are amazing places. Nancy Ammerman at Boston University does all her study on how exciting parishes are. Congregations are among the most dynamic, engaging, thoughtful, multicultural intersections of care, education, compassion, justice in America today. There are very few places left in America where the poor and the rich can intersect, where people of different classes, economic classes, can actually talk to one another. There are very few places in American society where people are actually being fed and their needs being met. What do parishes do? Deep-rooted values education, one of the few places that teach people deep-rooted values. Practical and engaged community mindedness. We're the reservoirs and the remnants of those who keep saying, but we belong to one another. We need to pay attention to one another. We need to pay attention to the climate and to the earth. Very few places left that do that. We are the ones who say we need to be about consolation and comfort and connection to the homebound, to the hospitalized, to those in nursing homes and assisted living. We're the places where people go for their last social safety net when government programs fail. We're the place that teaches education and practice in justice at the local, national, and global level. We should be proud of all that we do. Parishes have done amazing things. I think it's important for us, as we think about the new evangelization, is first to step back a little bit and ask how the old enthusiasm, how the old language and methodologies, who they worked for, and why did they work? And are they still working into the future? First, we might say that the old enthusiasms, the old methodologies did work, and they worked famously well for 2 generations. A builder generation that built the American Catholic experience in America. They did a phenomenal job. They came here largely as immigrants, not totally as immigrants, but largely as immigrants, and they had 1 mission and 2 tasks. They had to defend the faith in an alien land, because you got to remember that Catholics were not greeted with open arms in America. So they had to defend the faith in an alien land, and they had to move a generation of Catholics up and out of disadvantage as quickly as possible. That was the task of the builder generation. And how did they do? They did phenomenally well. They built the largest and most effective private school network the world had ever seen. They built the largest and most effective private healthcare network and social service safety net the world had ever known. They moved a generation of Catholics up and out of disadvantage faster than anyone expected. And how effective were they? 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices today are Catholic. The 2 vice presidential candidates are Catholic. The majority leader of the House of Representatives is Catholic. And the minority leader is Catholic. This would have been an absolutely unbelievable possibility to the builder generation, that it would have happened so quickly. But what it did, it happened because there was a cooperative relationship between priests, religious, and the laity. They worked together because the laity believed that the priests understood their needs and were going to give them institutional help. Institutions that could work to help them lift themselves up and become productive American citizens without losing their creeds. It was a stunning achievement. The boomers followed, and they had a simpler task, if you will, more complicated in some ways. Their job was to sustain the faith and then expand it. use the inherited faith to expand it, providing freedom, opportunity, and possibilities across the board. Now, whether boomers succeeded at that or not, I'll leave to your judgment. But it was an amazing and astounding thing. But something is happening. Something is happening that is making the new evangelization necessary. The Catholic Church is undergoing a profound transformation in America and around the world as it continues to respond to forces of unprecedented momentum and complexity. I call this the perfect storm of forces coming at American life at the very same time. Now, I want to talk just for a few moments very quickly about who's being affected by these transformations. I'm going to talk about the vast majority of Catholics, about young adults, about women, and parishes in new configuration. The vast majority of Catholics. Stated bluntly, we can now say that the vast majority of Catholics in America has no relationship and little contact with a priest. Priests no longer say Mass for them and no longer preach to them. They are no longer their confessors, their spiritual directors, or pastoral counselors. They are no longer their teachers of the faith or guides on the spiritual journey. Parishes are becoming drop-off centers for a growing number of young Catholic adult parents. When you look at the numbers of Catholics going to church on a monthly or a weekly basis, you begin to realize how true this statement is and how it is building across the country. Take a look at the numbers. People 70 years and older, the pre-Vatican II era, 45% of them go to Mass on a weekly basis. They're the only generation that approaches 50%. Those 52 to 69, only 24% go to church on a regular basis. Those 31 to 51, 15%. Those 18 to 30, 18% go to church on a regular basis. In the Archdiocese of Boston, as of this time last year when I did the statistics, 15.6% of Catholics go to church on a regular basis. Something is happening, okay? Now, there are two theories about why this is happening. The first theory is, this is how I hear it, I may be off. The first one is Catholics don't know who they are because they don't know what they believe, and because of this, they don't know how to act as Catholics in the 21st century. There's been a kind of catechetical drainage problem. The second theory is there's a loss of fit between what Catholics need and what they expect to get from their parish experience. It's a problem that researchers call a lack of a feeling of religious well-being. That people are beginning to feel that, why bother? It's not working for me. It doesn't seem to meet my needs. And what seems to be happening is that there's been this growing disconnection between people and the church over what they really need. We tell them what they need and they say, no, that's not it. Yes, it is. No, it's not. Yes, it is. No, it's not. And so what I'd like to do is talk to you about that second theory. You know the first one. That's pretty logical. What I've been proposing for almost a year, and it's published in Origins, is that there are a new set of challenges that are facing young adults, 22 to 40, which are 50.7% of adult population. We can extend that to people 17 to 50 within that population. Something is happening to their lives that makes the kinds of questions that they ask radically different than any generation before it. And what I propose is that it's the reinvention of work in America and across the globe, and the untested rules and looming fears governing the new economy. Something has happened culturally, outside of all of our control, where we have already moved from a relational culture that we once felt very comfortable in. A relational culture that emphasized faith and family as priority. That comes first. And what has happened is we've moved from this relational culture to a global work culture, which puts a high priority and a heavy price, especially on young people. You know this from your own experience of work. There was a time when you could go to work and there was a bargain made between you and your employer. You did a good job, you worked hard, you were educated, you were loyal to them, they were loyal to you. That loyalty has been severed. Now what's most important is profit. And we are all beholden to profit. And young people are trying to negotiate the same questions that every other generation has been trying to negotiate. They're no different from any other previous generation. What do they worry about? They worry what Catholics always worry about: love, commitment, children, a good life, greed, generosity, charity. But they're doing it in a whole different context now. And they have to negotiate it in this very difficult and sustained difficult economic world. So the question is, where has the church been in the development of this whole situation? How is it affecting? You may say, well, this is economics, it's about the career, this is about work. It doesn't have anything to do with religion. This is where my book, they said that I wrote a book on Franciscan economics. One of the things that I did was look at what is the impact on consumerism, on aggressive forms of capitalism, on the soul, on the spiritual life. And what I discovered was that it eats away at transcendent desire. It eats away at your motivation for God. It turns the need for the infinity of God into the need for the infinity of goods. It has a powerful impact on young people. It's one of the reasons why they don't see the importance of religion. Because consumerism has a corrosive spiritual impact that we haven't analyzed well enough, especially at the local level. So what's the ecclesial challenge? When the builder generation needed to defend the faith in an alien land, the church built first-rate public schools, parochial schools. When the builder generation asked for an education so that it could move their generation up and out of disadvantage as quickly as possible, the church provided first-rate high schools, colleges, universities all across this great land. And when this country had few social safety nets, we forget those days when we didn't have them. To provide for the poor who were sick and destitute, the church built the largest, most effective private network of hospitals, orphanages, soup kitchens, St. Vincent de Paul societies, charitable associations, the Knights of Columbus, to make sure that Catholics had what they needed to make it through the rough time. And so the question, when two successive generations of young post-boomer Catholics ask about jobs, unemployment, the state of the economy, how they're going to make it with the burden of debt they're likely to inherit. And it has an impact on their marriages. They're not getting married early because they can't. It's not an ideology question. It's an economic question for them. They're not sure they can make it. And so, and what we're seeing is that marriages is vulnerable. If it was ideology, where would marriage be in trouble first? California. Well, and then New York, right? The liberal coast. Where is it most vulnerable? According to the University of Virginia, it's vulnerable smack in the middle, in the heartland of America, because it's about economics. So, when all of these questions emerge, and when you ask young people, what are the two most important questions of your life? They say, job, unemployment. What's the second most important question you have? The future economic problems, the deficit. And so when they say to the church, here's our problem, what has been the response of the church? It's been deafening silence. So part of the issue that I'm talking to you about today is that a new evangelization has to enter into these kinds of questions if we want to attract young adults. We have to learn a new language. We need to engage them in a new dialogue about their greatest questions. But we do that in order to bring up their deepest desire, which is hidden from them by the very dynamics implicit in aggressive forms of consumerism. The second thing that I think we have to do for a new evangelization, and if we miss this, we miss something very important to our peril as Catholics. Catholic women have always been the backbone of the church. In every denomination, across all studies, women have been more orthodox, more practicing, more likely to bring their children up in the practice of the faith. They are more likely to be pastoral workers. I think every priest in this room, after Vatican II, will say to a person that one of the most beneficial things that happened after Vatican II was a deepening of the relationship with competent, intelligent, insightful women on pastoral staffs. Especially during the scandal, priests would not have been able to make it if they didn't have sturdy and supportive wisdom figures like the women in the room. But here's the problem. But here's the problem that we face, is that the research is now showing something that it has never shown us before. And I'm using the research of Sister Patricia Whitberg at Indiana State University. And what she has found is this: while both genders of millennial and Gen X Americans are far less devout than their elders, the women are even more alienated than the men are. If the church loses millennial and Gen X women, it will lose their children as well. Think about the implications. Women 17 to 50, for the first time in history, are less orthodox in their beliefs, more alienated from religion, and less likely to practice their faith than men their own age. If that doesn't get us to start thinking about a new enthusiasm, I don't know what will. We need a new language in order to deal with that issue. Now, we have adopted some language, but that language of polarization is not working for us. The language of feminism on one side
and a remnant church on the other side is not working. It's not going to solve the problem. We need to be more courageous and develop a new language in order to do what? To listen, to be in deep dialogue. This is a huge and unprecedented historical moment. And the new evangelization calls us to listen carefully and attentively and with respect. Women will not cross our thresholds. They will no longer enter our churches if they feel that there is a subtext of inferiority or invisibility. Generic sermons about life experiences are no longer enough. A new evangelization, what we need to do is develop an enthusiasm for the questions, enthusiasm for the dialogue. We need new methodologies in order to bring a new evangelization to bear for the majority of young women, young Catholic women who are now alienated from the church. I think that's an important aspect of our task at the parochial level. This month, Cardinal O'Malley, if he chooses to accept the recommendation of his Pastoral Planning Commission, will be, I think, the first bishop in the country to make multiple parish planning and pastoring normative. No other diocese will have made normative that pastors will be shared by parishes. This may be the first diocese to do that. I have two concerns about that bear on the task of the new evangelization. The first is the overwhelming entrance of bureaucracy that is emerging in parishes. Parishes across the United States are trying a corporate model of doing more with less, which makes sense in a business world. Just do more with less. Because streamlining efficiencies works when people are willing to sacrifice a bit of relationship to get something that they want. But is that where the Catholic Church is? The Catholic Church is not at a point where the request for product is very high. The request for product is very low. People are not knocking on the doors a lot. So we have to be very careful in how we approach this. We are in the business of relationship making. And so lulling ourselves into the myth that we will save ourselves by efficiencies alone is dangerous. The second thing I worry about is the stress level on priests and pastoral ministers. We have research already from James Burns at Boston University that indicates that priests in the Archdiocese of Boston, at least a significant portion, are still suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. We cannot simply add on more and more bureaucracies without a concomitant level of education and holistic formation at the same time. So, there's James Burns. My point is this, that the vast majority of young adult Catholics who need evangelization, who are part of the group that the Church is speaking about new evangelization a lot, can't see or feel our pastoral love for them because of the fog of consumerism that envelops their lives, that consumes their lives. And so we must be brave enough, smart enough, and spiritual enough to step beyond the stereotypes and burn away the fog with our passion for Christ. We need a new ministerial imagination. And that ministerial imagination cannot be an attitude of, well, we'll just wait until this whole thing just passes us by and we enter into the old normal again. That's not going to happen. There's no old normal coming back. We're entering a period of new normal. And the new normal is going to be urgent, it's going to be uncertain, and it's going to have a lot of high stakes. It's going to be exciting. It's the bottom line. It's going to be exciting, but it's going to be different. And we're going to need different methodologies. Now, there are some people who have said, yeah, we need a new ministerial imagination. 2 priests out in the Midwest, one of whom is a Capuchin, I won't tell you which one. One priest at an assembly of priests said what the ministerial imagination that we should have is that of a hospice worker. That the church is dying, it's in its last throes, and we should stand above it with the compassion of a hospice worker. He was applauded. He got a lot of applause. The second said, well, the problem with the church is that it's addicted to power. And there's nothing you can do about it. It has to hit bottom. But you can rage with prophetic impatience. I don't find either one of them quite helpful. Here's mine. Patristic image of perichoresis. I think you just have to dance with the saints. You just have, the relationship that we have with our people should be like a dance. That we are dancing with them, sometimes leading, sometimes following, sometimes lifting, sometimes falling, always stubbing our toes. But listening to the suggestive rhythms of the Spirit calling us into the future. We've got to find an image inside. That image may not work for you. But find an image inside of you that works, that gives you hope, that is a language of enthusiasm and passion, that gives you hope for building a realistic future for the Catholic Church in this part of the world. We need, in this new evangelization, we need to be healthy. The church has never expected from us perfection as pastoral ministers, but they do expect holiness. We can no longer preach a private Christ. We must preach a social Christ of communion. We need to be about accountability, transparency. In your packet, you'll see the 55 standards of excellence that are developed by the National Leadership Roundtable on Church Management. If you want to be able to get to the ability to be about a new evangelization, you can't be overwhelmed by bureaucracy. You've got to settle your systemic problems. And one way of doing that is by checking how well and how excellent your management is. If the pastor is overwhelmed with management, it's going to be very difficult for him to lead you in a new evangelization. So I'd ask you to think about that as a simple tool, a new methodology that can get you to a new evangelization. There are those in the church who are willing to say, it's almost over. So let's all become a remnant church. Let's be satisfied with the 15% who come to church. And, well, when they become 14, we'll be satisfied with that. When they become 10%, we'll be satisfied with that. It's okay to be a remnant church, a leaner, and some might say meaner church. Well, I'm going to stand here and say the opposite is required. What we need to be about is to be about a gathering church. We need to focus more on our gathering behavior not our dismissing behavior. Okay? So we need to audit all our welcoming behaviors. So in your packets, you're going to find all sorts of little tools that you can start to use to begin to assess how welcoming are you really. There's a little tool, the 40 ways to increase the number of your baptisms. There's an audit to take a look at the people that you forget. Sometimes, you just look at the people that you have and you forget about the people that you don't. Well, we need to start thinking about the people that we don't have. And so audit all your welcoming behaviors. Faulkner Hospital. How many people go to Faulkner? Anybody? Okay. When you walk into Faulkner Hospital, there's a woman sitting behind the desk as soon as you walk in. And there is a sign in front of her that says, Director of First Impressions. I wanted to kiss her. I said, you understand, every parish should have a Director of First Impressions. Right? Because you know what some of the first impressions are. But take a look at I'm asking you to audit the whole thing now. For welcoming, for gathering, for first impressions, for enthusiasm. Deep listening behavior. Gathering people for deep listening, not telling. We'll get there. We'll get to those moments. Understanding the deconversion process. 10.1% of the American population are former Catholics, people who have left the church. We need to step back and ask ourselves, what's our attitude towards people who have left or who are in the process of leaving the church? We have some very negative attitudes, don't we? We say negative things about them. They're heretics, apostates. I mean, most of my friends don't even know what an apostate is, but it sounds nasty. What I'm asking for all of us to do is to step back and ask ourselves, can we think about all the stages that go into the process of disaffiliating from the Catholic Church? They're long and they're painful. Maybe if we spent a little time thinking about them and talking to people about them, we might be able to intervene earlier and make a difference. Conflict in congregational life. We have a paradigm in our head about conflict in Catholicism. Peter Steinfeld said in his book, early 2000, that the Catholic Church is hopelessly divided between conservative Catholics and liberal Catholics. Study done not too long ago says 19,000 congregations a year have significant conflict going on in their midst. Maybe we need another way of thinking about our conflict and working through our conflict. When I was director of planning, I was seeing a lot of conflict. I was walking into a lot of conflict. I didn't bring the conflict. It came to be. One of the things I realized is that I didn't have all the skills I needed. So I went to Suffolk University School of Law and got trained as a professional mediator. It helped a little bit. So thinking about new ways of dealing with conflict as well. And finally, women. We have to have a new enthusiasm for women in our church. A new and deeper dialogue with women in our church. We will not survive well without that new moment. So, here's a question. Is time for questions? You may want to think about this. Given what you've heard, what one smart idea do you have to improve the new evangelization in your parish? And by smart, I mean specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. So if you can talk at your table about about that for a few moments, and then we'll open it up for a common discussion. Okay? Thank you.